company, and I want to show you what I've taken out of your book. You've quoted Mill in
Good,
here.
I'm glad to see you've read to page
I've
3.
tried my... two. Page 2, Doc. All right, let's... he's tough. This is a long hour, I'll tell you. Okay, here it is, John Stewart. The sole end for which mankind are warranted. This looks grammatically incorrect, but stay with us. Individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And then, okay. The only part of the conduct of anyone, I'm sorry, his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. In other words, let's understand that. For my own good, the government cannot pass what would be called forcible action. In other words, here's the way a person ought to be able to kill themselves if they want.
The right to commit suicide is a natural human right.
It's your life.
It's your life. Now,
and you don't want the government to spend any money to prevent you from doing that.
Absolutely not. Now, I am obviously, I as a friend of yours will try to prevent you. If you were a friend of mine and you suddenly got to a bridge and were going to jump over, I would certainly rush over and grab you and pull you up.
But you don't want public money to keep me from doing it.
Well, I would go farther. No, I want to go farther on a personal basis. I would reason with you. I would argue with you. But let's suppose after I had reasoned with you, after I had argued with you, I had failed to persuade you. Do I have the right to use force to prevent you from disposing of your own life? The clearest case of that, I certainly do not. I certainly do not. And you do not. And certainly, you do not have the right to put your hands in the pockets of other people in order to prevent somebody from doing something in his own value system. Now, you know, it's an interesting thing. Every time you bring up issues like this, people don't recognize what's been happening. Where is the rate of suicide highest? Is it in the countries that are free enterprise countries, or is it in socialist countries? Sweden has the highest rate of suicide of any of the Western countries. The last time I looked at the figures, maybe they've changed. Why? I don't mean why, but it's an interesting thing, interesting observation, that Sweden is one of the most government-controlled, socialist countries in the world. Yeah, but that hasn't prevented people from committing suicide.
Yeah, but the problem with
take the simpler cases. Don't take
this point has to be made. The problem with your point is that this is hardly anymore the best representative example of what the free enterprise system ought to be. So you yourself are America's severest critic. You think we've blown Adam Smith's theory here in America. So we should have people jumping off bridges left and right here. Not because it's a bad...
We do.
Well,
we do. Look at the number of people.
The point you just made.
No, it doesn't, because we have become so socialist. Look at the extent to which people are opting out of the world by going in for drugs, by going in for various other activities of this kind, which are a delayed form of committing suicide.
Yes.
One of the problems of our society is that by having all responsibility assigned to the government, we have removed the pressure on individuals to be responsible for themselves, to feel that they have a set of values that they are entitled to pursue. So that, no, I don't believe there's...
I assume then that if somebody wants to smoke marijuana, that's their business too.
That's his business, absolutely.
Are we going to take that to heroin and addiction?
Absolutely. Now, let me go back on that one, because that's a very interesting thing. Even if on ethical principles, you believe it is right to prevent somebody else from smoking heroin, as a matter of expediency, it's a terrible mistake. The largest...
So is jumping off the bridge.
No, I don't mean that. I mean it's a terrible mistake for society to render heroin illegal, because that increases the harm which heroin does. Why do we have so much crime in the inner cities and in the cities? Over 50% of it is attributed to crime for the sake of acquiring money to buy heroin. Why is heroin so expensive? Because it's illegal. We went through this with prohibition. Whether you believe it's right or wrong to prevent people from drinking alcohol, we had the experience with prohibition in which we found that it did more harm than good.
And a lot of guys got shot in the garage.
A lot of guys got shot, and the more important, the basic respect for law was eroded. law-abiding people who would never ordinarily have broken the law broke the law in order to get a drink?
Because they knew that the law enforcement agencies could not possibly enforce with any efficiency the laws against the prohibition law.
But the reason they couldn't enforce it was because it wasn't publicly backed. If the 90% of the public had been in favor of the prohibition law, you could have enforced it.
But I'm promising you 90% of the public right now is in favor of enforcing prohibition against heroin.
And you cannot enforce it. I agree. I was understating my case. Even with 90% of the people, you can't enforce it. And it does vastly more harm today because it is illegal than it would do if it were legal. Let me point out for a moment that more lives are lost each year through drinking alcohol than through heroin.
But
if there's a case, if you're going to make the case for preventing heroin on the basis of saving lives, there's a much stronger case for prohibition of alcohol.
But there would be some who would argue that to relax law enforcement or to take away law enforcement pressure on heroin trade is to ensure that heroin deaths will meet and exceed alcohol deaths.
On the contrary, it would reduce the number of heroin deaths. Why would it reduce the number of heroin deaths? In the first place, many of the deaths come from impure or adulterated heroin or needles that are contaminated. In the second place, as we found in Prohibition, the fact of Prohibition encouraged alcoholism rather than the opposite. To the young people in particular, it became an adventure to go out and get drunk, to go to a speakeasy. Today, with heroin illegal, it pays a heroin pusher to create an addict. Because, given that it's illegal, it's worth his while to spend some money on getting somebody else hooked. Because once hooked, he has a captive audience. If heroin were readily available everywhere, it wouldn't pay anybody to create an addict. Because the addict could then go anywhere to buy it. You have had experience with this. Britain has had legalized, not heroin in general, but they have had an arrangement under which certified addicts can get heroin from physicians on prescription.
I assume.
And it's done very much less harm than our system has. So I have no apologies for believing that far less harm would be done to this country by legalizing heroin than is now being done by trying to enforce heroin prohibition.
I assume, like the baby in the car, you would support legislation prohibiting the sale of heroin and other addictive substances to juveniles.
Well, that's a very hard question. I think there is a different case for juveniles. But whether you could really handle the question, that's a question of expediency, not a principle. If I thought I could enforce it, I would be willing to say that for juveniles. But I'm not sure I could enforce it, and I'm not sure when I looked into it I wouldn't decide I did more harm than good even there.
You'll agree that this is the issue that lays bare the whole notion of your personal statement, and this is where we get to the practical realities of sweat and blood, everyday life with parental anxiety. Where are my kids? What are those sirens? Who's selling what to whom? What are they doing in the car? Who's sniffing, smoking, drinking? What is happening out there? And for all of the adulation that you've received, standing ovations everywhere you go, this is a very difficult platform for you to
I don't believe so. I don't believe so, because I believe it corresponds to the real understanding and interests and beliefs of the vast majority of the American people. I think that you have to distinguish between the attitudes of the public at large and the attitudes of a relatively small group of people who have been trying to persuade the public to have different views.
I know that, Dr. Friedman. And
look at Prohibition.
Yeah, I am. It didn't work. Okay, it didn't work.
And why did you get it adopted in the first place? If the people in this audience who are predominantly female will pardon me, it was only adopted because the young males were away in France during World War I, and the women of the country voted in Prohibition.
All right.
Now, that's neither good nor bad. It's a pure statement of historical fact.
Yeah. The irony, though, let's not miss the irony here. The irony is that you are the darling of the conservative, of almost, is there anybody left who doesn't think we have too much government? And you are as eloquent a spokesman against that abuse as there is walking around today.